So our guests tonight are Katie Mears, a journalist who writes about comedy for Vulture and a contributing author for the book The Dark Side of Stand-Up Comedy. She has a YouTube channel where she interviews comedians and covers modern stand-up. And keep your eye on this. You can catch her back here at the Mark Twain House in October as part of our Trouble Begins series discussing Twain's lectures. Katie's going to be talking tonight with Wayne Federman, a stand-up actor, author and professor. He's been a touring comedian for more than 35 years, has appeared on The Tonight Show multiple times, most recently just 2 weeks ago. He has his own stand-up special on Comedy Central, and he co-produced the Emmy-winning documentary The Zen Diaries of Garry Shandling. He's currently co-producing a George Carlin documentary for HBO. Can't wait to see that. You might recognize Wayne, as I did, from numerous films and TV shows, including Legally Blonde, Knocked Up, Step Brothers, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Silicon Valley, and The X-Files. And I'm grateful to my colleague, Ilana Stolman, who introduced Wayne to us. And with no further ado, please join me in welcoming both Katie and Wayne to the screen. Katie. And here comes Wayne. I'm sorry, it takes just a second to get everybody lined up here.
Hello.
Thank you, Jennifer, very much. Thank you.
Thank you. The kind introduction.
And Katie, you'll call me back up when it's time to do Q&A?
Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. Enjoy, and I'll be back in a little bit then.
Thanks.
Love it.
Hello.
I'm looking already at the chat. I'm loving the chat already. Yeah. People from St. Louis. I saw someone who was here from Potomac, Maryland. Oh. I don't know if you know this, Katie, but I split my childhood between Silver Spring, Maryland, which is right near, not as wealthy as Potomac, and then moved to maybe the most racially insensitive name for a city in the United States, Plantation, Florida. It's a real place. It exists. Ask anyone in the chat if they've ever heard of it.
Okay.
And to make it worse, I went to South Plantation High. I'm from the less progressive part of a place called Plantation. That's where I'm from. So let's go. Let's talk about Mark Twain. Let's talk about stand-up. Oh, Austin, Texas. I love it.
Yeah, amazing.
By the way, Austin, Texas is becoming a new comedy hub.
Yeah,
in the history of
a certain direction.
Yeah. We'll see what
building a club there. We'll see what happens.
I think it's going to be big. Congratulations! I mean, it's already known as this great music hub for years now, and they have that. What is that big show they have there every year? The big convention. I'll think of it in a second. But anyway, what's up, Katie? Katie is here to ask me some questions. Yeah. And then we're going to talk back and forth. And I have some questions for Katie as well. Milwaukee in the house. Milwaukee, I love it.
Oh, Moon Tower. That's
Moon
the
Tower.
Answer to your question. Yes, indeed.
Moon Tower Comedy.
You're already helping us out from the chat. I love it.
And South by Southwest. Peter and Josh. Peter and Josh you should be talking to those two guys. You should be talking to those two guys.
Well, let's zero in here. We're here to talk about your book. We're here to talk about history of stand-up. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about how this book came together and your initial interests?
Well, I've been, as you know, based on what Jennifer just said, I've been a stand-up for a long time. But even when I was in high school in Plantation, Florida, at South Plantation High, I was into old-timey comedy. Like everyone, all the comedy nerds in high school, we were into Carlin and Pryor and Robert Klein and Cheech and Chong. But me, I was into Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy because I did ventriloquism. And that brought me to Jack Benny and Fred Allen and all of those radio guys. There was a guy named Ed Wynn. So even when I was a kid, breaking out, not getting dates, the whole thing, I was into stand-up comedy, and my teachers said, "Hey, Wayne, you should be a comedian." So that's how I started. And then I ended up going to NYU, and there was comedy clubs there. There was no comedy clubs in Florida when I was a kid. So so that's how it kind of started. Okay. And then a few years ago, I started writing articles for first called Splitsider, then called Vulture magazine. And then I got hired at USC to teach a class, which led to this podcast called The History of Stand-Up. Somebody earlier, I hope that's the podcast they were saying that they loved, but I'm assuming.
Presumably. It's a
Yeah,
safe bet.
exactly. But anyway, so that's the short of it. That's the short of it.
Right. And when did
Any
you decide to
follow-ups?
turn
Any
that
follow-ups?
into
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I only had the one question.
Oh,
No.
okay. Guys, thank you for coming out. This has been a blast.
No, when did you decide to turn it into a book, into something you can hold in your hands?
Well, I mean, this is sort of, it grew out of an article I wrote for Vulture called Stand-Up Comedy History in 10 Steps. And I started in 1947 and I went to today because 47 is a very big year because that's when the term came around.
Yeah.
But there were certainly, Katie, you're a comedy nerd, you know this. There was comedians doing stand-up comedy before it was called stand-up. They were called monologists or comedians or something. And that's why I bring Mark Twain in that, because for years, a lot of people would call what Mark Twain did, and we're here at the Twain house virtually, as a humorist, right? But if you really break down what he was doing, that's a stand-up comedy story, standing on stage, making people laugh without, by the way, a microphone. Very tough to do, very tricky to do.
There are some comedy scholars that believe the beginning of stand-up is really tied to the invention of the microphone because stand-up,
we're not going to talk about those historians because we want Mark Twain to be part of the stand-up world. But yes, I agree with that. This microphone right here, not this one particularly, but a microphone.
Right.
What it did was, and you can join in, was it allowed comedians to be loud while speaking soft. It allowed comedians to have a intimacy with the crowd that they couldn't have before. For those people who were music buffs, the same thing absolutely happened in music, where you had like an Al Jolson, like a real belter, and then suddenly, hey, Bing Crosby and Sinatra. There's no such thing as a crooner without a microphone. Doesn't exist. So does that? So yes, the microphone.
It's a big step. But there's definitely a lot of art forms that led into stand-up comedy that had a real closeness with stand-up before. I know people often talk about vaudeville and burlesque and minstrelsy, and then the lecture tours, which is what Twain did, which is often left out of the conversation. So
not anymore.
During writing that article, what made you first decide to look further back and include Twain?
Well, it's because again, you were speaking earlier about like some people think stand-up starts when a microphone started. Some people think stand-up started when the term stand-up started in 1947. Other people think it was when Mort Saul was at the Hungry I. Like there's a number of theories.
A lot of discourse on it.
So what I did was I was like, let's define what the heck stand-up comedy is. This is something I do.
Which is really hard. It's very hard. It is hard.
But I think basically we know that it's one person. We know stand-up comedy is one. If you're doing a comedy team, that's not stand-up comedy, even though the Sklar brothers are sort of doing stand-up as two people.
Right. There's always going to be an exception.
There's exception, right. But as a rule, it's one person standing on stage with the expectation of somebody laughing. Like that's why they're paying their ticket. That's why they're going to see this person. They are going to laugh. So it's that, as I say in my book, thrilling to terrifying experience that binds all comedians. And then when I saw that Mark Twain, because he lost a lot of money in a startup because he wanted to print his own books or whatever, you know more about it than I do, had to get some money. He was like, I'm going to do what they called lecture tour back then. But I was just reading the reviews yesterday of the American part of the tour before he went overseas. This is, we're talking about 1895, right? That's the big tour?
1894, I believe.
Oh, okay. So anyway, I'm wrong. Don't buy my book. Get Katie's book. So that already, like all of those dates that he did in the United States, that was in Michigan, and then we went to Montana, and then Seattle and Portland, and then Little Canada, Little Manitoba, before he went to Hawaii, and then the whole world. Everyone who went to those lectures were like, oh, I know this guy from the books. And I want to hear him speak. And the reviews were like, people were laughing beginning to end. And that's what I was hearing. So I mean, that's what I was reading. And this was another interesting fact I just learned, that one of the guys, I believe it was because he did Minneapolis and Duluth, but which, by the way, is where a great comedian named Maria Bamford is from.
Yeah.
He did an hour and 20 minutes. The guy timed him.
Mm-hmm.
So I know it was either an hour 20 to an hour and a half was the length of the show. So that's a headlining stand-up comedian. That's something George Carlin would have done.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, and yeah. Any other questions? Or are we done? We're ready to go to the group. We go to the crowd.
Yeah, no, but I want to know who else, in addition to Mark Twain, do you include in that sort of proto stand-up comedy world? Are you reading comments that are making you laugh?
I would know. They're great. Guys, I knew it. I knew the chat was going to be awesome. I knew it was going to be better than anything I said.
Yeah. Is anything catching your eye?
There's, a little about Mort Saul and Dick Gregory and Bob Newhart sitting down. Yes, because here's the great story of stand-up. The book should probably say from Artemus Ward to Dave Chappelle, but nobody knows who Artemus Ward is. But Artemus Ward was doing humorous lectures years before Mark Twain was. I think even before there was a Mark Twain. What year did he adapt the name Mark Twain?
I'm not sure specifically. I think
62? Maybe someone in the chat. Yeah.
About right. Yeah. I would guess around there, because he would have been late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah, he was in Nevada, I assume, when it all happened. So
yeah, because he had a bunch that he used before he really stopped.
Oh, he did? There was another before Mark Twain?
Oh, he had a bunch of names. Yeah.
Ironically, one of them, Paula Poundstone. Very weird. Very weird.
Who knew?
Who knew? But Artemus Ward kind of was one of the first, if not the first, to make fun of this lecture circuit, which was called at the time. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Mallory. In 1863, this lecture tour at the time, which was called the Lyceum Circuit, and where it was basically TED Talks, right? Is that how you describe them, Katie?
Yeah. Really long, pretty dry, often with a moral or with a lesson involved.
Oh, there was a moral too. Okay. But it was like about botany or mythology or the American Revolution or something like that. So anyways, Artemus was the first one to tour, and he made a lot of money. And then in Nevada, when he tours Nevada, guess who sees him? Is Sam Clemens. I call him Sammy Clemens. And they strike up a friendship.
Yeah.
But more important to me, and what I write about in my book, The History of Stand-Up. You don't have to buy it. I don't want to buy it. I don't like people pushing. Was that he was inspired by the way he told jokes, which was a very dry, offhanded, never laughed at his own stuff, and was almost surprised when there was a laugh. He wrote about it in the, what's the article you sent me? What's it called?
Oh, How to Tell a Story.
How to Tell a Story.
Twain wrote that he really dives into what I think we would call, from a modern lens, the difference between telling jokes and stand-up comedy. This idea that the jokes are sort of embedded and they turn into bits and they kind of pop up, as opposed to this big bursting presentation that you normally get with a joke. Yeah.
Okay, somebody's asking, what about Oscar Wilde? Look, there was obviously witty people in the world well before Artemus Ward, well before there was a minstrel show. There was
I mean, we can talk about Diogenes if we want to.
Yes.
You can always go further back.
We can, and when I was kind of researching the book, I found that almost every culture, Native Americans, in India, actual Indians, in Mexicans, like the almost every culture had some element of some funny dude. I assume it was I'm guessing the guy was a insecure extrovert. That's going to be my guess. That they always existed. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Charlie Case. Oh, geez. Charlie Case is way after Mark Twain and all of that. This is a very smart crowd.
I know scholars that will say, no, Charlie Case was the first.
And what is the case they make for Charlie Case? No pun intended. What is the Charlie Case?
I know that I think it's Eddie Tafoya who really fought for Charlie Case. He was a minstrel and he would tell long bits and jokes during the minstrel shows.
But he was in blackface, right?
Yes, he was in blackface. And I think, I don't know if we're sure, but I believe was a black man who would black up extra in blackface, which is often the case in minstrel shows, and very, very odd.
Well, Burt Williams, but there's people probably in this chat right now that are old enough to remember there was a comedian that I remember when I was a kid named Dewey Pigmeat Markham, who was kind of a sketch comedian, and he wore blackface for the first 3/4 of his career. And so it was just a weird, I don't want to get into blackface and minstrel. How do you say it? Minstrelly? You said something else earlier.
Oh, minstrelesque.
Yeah.
But you had a story in your book that I hadn't heard of before about the first time Ward realized that he could tell his jokes on stage. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
So, tell me that.
Let's go back to 1860, before the Civil War starts for real. I guess there's a presidential election that year. And Artemus Ward is a newspaper dude at a little place. Thank you, Juliana. Artemus Ward is a newspaper man at the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Still exists, that paper. Part of his job, besides writing these funny letters that went out and made him famous, was I'm the entertainment reporter. I'm going to see what the locals, there's no movies back then. There might be a play. There might be a lecture. But the big thing was the minstrel show came to town. So we went to cover the minstrel show and for the paper. Now, Artemus Ward, just so you know, was writing these funny letters that were signed Artemus Ward, also a pen name, very much like Mark Twain. His real name, believe it or not, Katie, Charlie Brown.
Charlie Brown.
So he would write. So he's already famous for kind of this, making between $12 and $14 a week, depending on whose biography you're reading at Cleveland. So it goes to minstrel show. Guess what happens at the show? One of the guys, the comedians in the minstrel show, there's two side comedians and kind of an MC at these shows, starts doing some Artemus Ward jokes.
Oh,
stealing jokes right out of his newspaper column. And so he was like, what the hell is going on? And at first he's supposedly shocked, and then got the idea of like, wait a minute.
Hold on. If he can do it.
Exactly. This thief can do my material. I wrote it. Maybe I could do a better version of this. And that's how we got the idea to bring Artemus Ward from paper to the stage. And so
and doing it without all of the accoutrement of a minstrel show, just doing it normal dress, no props, going on stage, telling jokes. That was sort of revolutionary.
And here was his hook, Katie. You're going to love it.
Tell me.
He goes on stage, and his theme of his lecture is, let me make sure I get this right because I always confuse, babes in the woods, or babe in the woods, or something like that.
Yeah.
And he gets on stage, and he starts to address babes in the woods, and then does a tangent, and then does a tangent of a tangent, and the whole act, and it gets more and more laughter as they realize, oh, he's never going to talk about babes in the woods. And
has he forgotten? Did he?
You're right. Has he forgotten? And all the time, whenever people would laugh, he would look up, like, what's going on? Like, I'm trying to be serious here. So it was what became known as deadpan comedians, which if we would, in the modern era, that might be somebody like Stephen Wright, or if you're a little older, there was a guy named Pat Paulson who did very deadpan comedy. And that means no expression. Like your pan is dead. I don't know why it means deadpan.
Sure.
I don't know. So anyway, that was the start of it in New York City. And it became so popular. It was like a phenomenon and he toured not only the United States, old Artemus Ward, AKA Charlie Brown.
Yeah. So why do you think
they find out about him in England, and he goes over to England and performs over there as well.
Right.
Go ahead. What was your question?
I was going to say, he was huge. How come we never really hear about him? Why do you think his story's largely lost to history?
Because this is, again, a theory. This is the Federman theory. I would love in the chat if anyone could shoot this down. My theory is that those 1800s guys were considered humorists and weren't even they didn't even think of them as modern comedians. So they were less like, oh, well, they're not really doing mother-in-law jokes, or they're not really doing a joke about the new jet airplane or radio stuff. And so they were just dismissed, because I think part of the thing, and the reason Twain, it's been slow, is acknowledgement, right?
Yeah.
You've been around. Has it been in your lifetime that they've started calling him a stand-up? Because you're more an expert on Twain than I am.
Yeah, I would say so. A lot of scholars have their pick on where stand-up comedy starts, and I'm used to it starting in the aughts and in the teens. It's usually around there. It's usually with, Frank Fay, vaudeville MCs, but there's a lot before it. And depending on how loose your definition of stand-up is, you can go pretty far back.
Yeah, I don't think it's that. Yeah, so that's one of the reasons I think Artemus Ward and Mark Twain were late to the game. But then as I've examined it, and who's the gentleman who wrote the book about the tours? Your friend from
Richard
New York?
Sachs. He wrote a really wonderful book about
what is that called?
Twain's
What's that book?
tour. It's called Chasing the Last Laugh.
Yeah,
highly recommend.
Yeah, so that's so anyway, but his scholarship, I think, helped open people's eyes, like, oh, Twain might be the guy. And then when I learned that Twain was inspired by Artemus Ward, and of course,
you can always go one step back.
Yeah, but Artemus Ward comes out of, was just inspired by minstrel guys who were part of a big variety show. But here's another thing that I think Twain also gets a little credit for, is because once a year we give the Mark Twain Prize to the funniest or the person who made a huge impact in humor in this country. So
it doesn't go to novelists, right? The Mark Twain Award goes to
doesn't go to Dave Garry. Yeah.
Right. And it's so funny that most of his legacy is often novels, and people can forget that he did all these lecture tours and meant so much to early stand-up.
Right. But anyway, he was obviously a genius and all of that. But that's why I put him on the cover of my book, because I felt like I wanted to say, if we really think about what stand-up comedy is, and really think about even today with Chappelle and Amy Schumer and Bill Burr and everything, and back, the great ones from the 70s prior, they're all kind of doing the same thing. They're different venues, although not always. I mean, some of those theaters that Twain played still exist today. But it's still the same idea. Somebody going into a comedy club, somebody going into the thing, paying to see this person. Now there's ancillary, I hope that's the right word, like there's records, there's Netflix specials, there's
a lot of routes to the same end point.
There's another ways to monetize it, sell it, and move it into different areas. But the mission statement of it all, and somebody was just talking about Charlie Case. He's trying to get laughs. Charlie Case is sitting there, and I know someone just in the chat, I'm sorry if I'm a little all over the place, was talking about the sit-down comedians like Shelley Berman and Dick Gregory in the late 50s, early 60s.
Sure, up there.
Charlie Case was also known for sitting down as well and on stage and doing this. So it was Chase and Julius Tannen and a guy named Frank Fay. All were part of this new vanguard of comedians who would just talk directly to the crowd, not part of the comedy team.
Yeah, who are the big names between Twain and 1947?
Oh, well, the biggest, because, the history of stand-up, my book, if you want to buy it, you don't have to. I'm telling you, you don't have to buy the book.
Buy it.
A lot of it is the story of technology and the story how venues change. So, like we talked about the microphone. And then in 1926, I don't like them pushing this book, a little company called the National Broadcasting Company went on the air. And and on their very first broadcast, they had a comedy team called Weber and Fields, which were huge in vaudeville, and a stand-up comedian who used to be a roper by the name of Will Rogers.
Hey.
So, and you know very much about Will Rogers. So now comedians were on the radio, and so that became, there was huge radio stars like I talked about earlier. Jack Benny, obviously, But even ones that aren't quite as famous that were huge in vaudeville, two I'm going to speak about. One was by the name of Ed Wynn, who was very popular in vaudeville and on Broadway, had this character, this kind of dithering, giggly guy called the Perfect Fool. And then Eddie Cantor, who was sort of like a Sammy Davis Jr. He could do jokes, he could sing, he could dance, he would prance around the stage, he could do comedy. He was he was a bit of a show business force, and they both had very popular radio shows. And but I'm saying, there's just too much to talk about. But basically, that was the next generation. So that, along with Bob Hope and Jack Benny and Fred Allen, certainly were the next generation of young comics. It's hard to think of Bob Hope as a young comic, but he was.
Truly.
Yeah. I mean, Scott Wood, Ed Wynn. I love it. There's supposed to be a program.
Whoa. Is that a dig at us?
I don't know. I love insult comedy. We're talking about the history of stand-up.
Sweet. I'm curious, has being a professor, has teaching this in the classroom changed your perspective at all on comedy history?
No,
No.
I think the thing, I don't know, Katie, the thing that's interesting to me is like how fast it turns over. And like, for example, like for the kids that I that I teach now, a lot of them are born in this century. They're not from the 1900s.
Wow.
Right. So to them, Dimitri Martin is an old comedian from the 90s of the last century that maybe their parents liked.
So
and I think of him as like a young comic, but it's not at all.
Well, he also feels younger because he's had the same haircut for 30 years.
Right. So somebody wrote burlesque, vaudeville, Catskills, then clubs. Scott Wood, he knows his stuff here. Why don't you do me a favor? Why don't you read the 10 chapters of my book so they know exactly, and the Shandling Circuit. Scott, you should have helped me. You should
and radio too.
So
just a little. He has a really great timeline too. He won't tell you this, but Wayne has a great timeline in the back of the book as well for just a little overview of comedy. But the main sections that he has, so the chapters in the book,
just 10. Yeah.
The four forefathers. So that's Artemus, Twain, Bert, and Will. Is that right?
Bert Williams and Will Rogers. Those are I call the four forefathers.
And then vaudeville and burlesque, radio days, nightclubs, resorts, and theater, which is
nightclubs.
A lot of the Catskills we're talking about. TV
in Miami and Vegas. Yeah.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Vegas, that's huge. TV and the New Wave, and then coffee houses, comedy clubs, and Carson. HBO, SNL, and Pryor. The Boom, referring to the 80s comedy boom, and then alternative, and urban comedy, which is more 90s. And then the last one is digital domain, so how it all went online.
Yes, that's part of literally this is happening right now. The fact we're doing this online is part of that.
Right.
And yes.
All of the COVID different options, whether it was outdoor shows or online shows, a lot had to evolve, and it was rad to see how comedy rose to the occasion there.
Right.
So
so all of those things are covered in the book, and it's brief. It's 150 pages. It's not a long slog. And if you don't want to read 150 pages, there's like you said, a timeline that's 7 pages. So I start with Artemus Ward, believe it or not. But yes, I mean, this is the thing I love is every era of it. I love the vaudeville. I love burlesque. I love the nightclub era.
Yeah.
And then can we talk briefly, and this might be offensive because there's a couple people that I'm going to mention are kind of, one of them is in jail and the other one is sort of not well spoken of these days. There was a scene that happened in the early 60s in New York that's covered in this television show called The Marvelous Mrs Maisel.
Mm-hmm.
And in real life, in the early 60s, a bunch of comedians were there, but 5 comedians really took stand-up to a whole new level. And they were all there at the same time. Carlin, Richard Pryor, Woody Allen, Bill Cosby, and Joan Rivers, all in the Village, trying to get onto what was then the Ed Sullivan Show. And can I say something real quickly? It's not funny, but at every point along, I'm being sarcastic. At every point along, there's always been like a destination booking for stand-ups that like
dream gig
that sort of stamped a legitimacy to them.
Right.
Like in the vaudeville days, it was something like the Palace was the middle. If you played the Palace, that was like Yankees playing baseball for the Yankees or something. Like you were a made man. Sure. And then in the nightclub era, it was like if you played the Copa in New York City, that was that. Oh my God. Then you could work all the other clubs.
Yeah.
And then when television came around, playing the Ed Sullivan Show. And then the Tonight Show. I don't know if anyone's watching The Story of Late Night, but that's on CNN right now.
Getting on
Ben Carson and Parr and those guys. Like to get on the Tonight Show, could make a career. I talked quite a bit about Freddie Prinze in December 1973. So it's like really fast. And then after that, get an HBO special. And now Netflix. Now if you have a Netflix special.
I think I understand the urge to have something that feels really big because stand-up is often a career where you don't get like, I don't know, if you want to be a doctor, you graduate in your certificate and you become a doctor. For stand-up, it's a little more amorphous when you feel like you've made it. So these things crop up as like a real stamp of approval, you know? It's just nice.
Yeah, and even there was I know a lot of people thought like, oh, if you were on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, you were made. And that was true. That happened for Seinfeld. That happened for Garry Shandling. That happened for Roseanne Barr. Freddie Prinze in 73. Obviously, Stephen Wright. But there were a lot of comedians that did multiple spots on the Tonight Show that never maybe bumped up their road gig.
Yeah.
I mean, multiple. I'm talking about 20 spots on the Tonight Show. So it wasn't for everyone. And actually, Bill Maher talked about this, that he did a lot of spots on the Tonight Show before he,
Someone asked here, who was the first to make it big on radio?
Great question. Katie, I love using but guys, first of all, thank you for participating.
Yeah,
we've had amazing comedian. There was really two comedians, and I mentioned those earlier. The first two the first was a radio show that came out of Chicago that was called Amos and Andy, which was two white guys doing black dialect voices. But the first stand-ups or comedians at the time were Ed Wynn and Eddie Cantor were the first two, before Benny, before Fred Allen, before George Burns and Gracie Allen, Duffy's Tavern, before all of that. So those were the first. But it was it was exciting time, radio. I mean, can you just imagine, just everyone out there listen, just think how mind-blowing it must have been, stand-up comedy aside, to have invisible waves travel through the air, through your front door, into this machine. And then out of it came a radio program out of New York or Los Angeles. And for the first time in human history, I don't mean to get emotional about this, like multiple people across many miles could hear the same voice at the same time. I mean, it's just now we just, we don't even care. We send a text or on Instagram Live, we don't care. But that must have just been mind-blowing for those people. What else do they have, Katie?
Yeah. Do we want to get Jen back in here to facilitate some questions?
I don't know. I think you're doing good. Oh, Scott Wood said you're the best. Oh, David Letterman. Oh, somebody wants me to talk. Katie, you can do this. David Letterman is very important because what happened was in 1972, The Tonight Show moves from New York City, Studio 6B, with Carson to Burbank, Studio 1. And when Freddie Prinze, we talked about him earlier, gets anointed and becomes Chico and the Man and all of that, there was a mass migration of comedians to Los Angeles. One of them from Indiana was a guy named Dave Letterman, funny weather guy. Another one was Jay Leno. Another was Garry Shandling. Another was Robin Williams. Another was, it just kept going. It was just the Mecca to come there. And Letterman is so fascinating because he did The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And 2 months later, a little over 2 months, he was guest hosting the show.
Wow.
Just think about that. Like young comedian. Oh, Amos and Andy.
And he's a recipient of the Mark Twain Award.
Yes, he is a Mark Twain recipient. Yeah. Most of the Mark Twain recipients are stand-ups, by the way. There are others. I think Carol Burnett and
right in there.
Yeah, and Will Ferrell, but there's a lot. My favorite has to be Um, Jonathan Winters. I just feel like Jonathan Winters was such a unique, genius level comedian. And I know I mentioned her earlier, but if you ever get a chance to check out Maria Bamford, she's like a new aged version of Jonathan Winters. She does voices. She does stream of consciousness. She's just absolutely brilliant. If you want, just an idea. Yeah. And can I also mention two other quick things? And please check the chat because
we have a ton of questions that we can get to when we're ready. Yeah.
No, I love it. Guys, this is so fun. And I can't believe it all goes back to Mark Twain, aka Artemus Ward. Yeah. Also, that for a long time until 1961 January in Chicago, stand-up comedy was pretty segregated. For the most part, there was a black circuit called the Chitlin Circuit, and then the white nightclubs. And black comedians did perform in some venues, Red Fox and stuff, but it wasn't until Dick Gregory in January 1961 at the Playboy Club performed in front of an all-white crowd. Went over great, had really smart stuff, all about civil rights.
Huge. Yeah.
Huge moment in the history of stand-up, guys. But he was like the Jackie Robinson of stand-up comedians. And then he got on the Jack Parr show, and it was an interesting little thing. Jack Parr called him up and he was like, do you want to come on the show? And he goes, I won't come on your show unless I can sit down and do panel. Because he had seen other black acts.
He didn't want to just do the stand-up and then leave.
Yeah. Really smart.
Yeah, get in there.
And then New York Times, Esquire, and stuff like that. So that's one thing I really wanted to mention. And another was two comedians that a lot of people don't know about. One, she was kind of a variety performer in the early part of the century named Elsie Janus. She did impressions. She's also an actress. She did a number of things. But she also had this vaudeville actor. She did impressions.
She's never brought up.
Because she also was an actress, I think. But she is the first performer 20 years before Bob Hope, 20 years before there was the USO existed in World War I, performed for the troops, American troops overseas in France. Wow. And if you've seen the movie 1917, that's a tough war. There's mustard gas. It's like it's not a pleasant place to be. So I just want to give her and this comedian named Gene Carroll, who was doing stand-up in the 40s, was also one of the great trailblazers of. Yeah, because it was a bit of a boys' club. Let's be honest, it was. Those are the facts. What else do we got going on, Katie? What else?
So one of the questions is, how much money did Sam make doing his lecture tours? Sam meaning Mark Twain, of course.
Oh, Sammy. I call him Sammy. I didn't know who you were talking about.
Our guy. Yeah.
Well, that's all I know is he was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt when he started. Is that correct, Katie? You're the one who wrote the paper on him.
If we're talking specifically about the worldwide tour that he did in the mid 1890s, he exclusively went on that tour to make money.
Right. How much did he make?
I'm not sure, but I think it was a tremendous amount. If Jennifer knows, she can tell us, but a tremendous amount. And he paid off all of his debts, even the ones that he was under no legal obligation to do so. He went around the world. He made the money back that he owed. And when he came back,
how much? You don't know? There's not a dollar amount?
I don't know specifically.
I thought it was like hundreds of thousands of dollars. So
it was that magnitude.
Yeah, sure. It was a lot. And
but everyone was so excited. Yeah, like when he came back, every newspaper that wrote about it was like Twain's triumphant return. He's come back. He's made good, and it was a huge moment. But it was like a last resort to. They were getting ready to seize his assets. It got really, really dire.
Would they have seized this house that we're in right now, metaphorically?
So this house is a complicated part of it. He actually wasn't living in this house any longer at that point because he got to the place where he couldn't really afford to live in the Hartford house anymore.
So this is the Hartford. Did he have rented out? Was it like an Airbnb situation?
They had renters and they lived in Europe during that time.
But when he came back, I thought he came back to the United States. Okay.
I'm pretty sure. So it's complicated because you hear that he couldn't really afford to live in that house anymore, but you have to remember that living in that house includes a ton of maids, a ton of cooks, a coachman. Like there's a lot involved in that.
Right.
Another question that we have is the Mark Twain house in any imminent danger of closing down? I assume it's been hard in these times.
Okay.
So that's something that Jennifer can speak to, but I'm sure that they really appreciate any donations. The next question, are there any transcripts of Twain's lectures or presentations? So
I have seen some. I've seen some. There was one guy who wrote something, it wasn't the complete, but it's on that Mark Twain website. That's Barbara, I can't think of her name, who runs it, does a great job with that. But yes, there is some of it. And obviously, one of the reasons I don't quote comedy in my book that much is that it's like, I feel like a lot of it loses the juice of the stand-up when you put it on paper, because stand-up is an interactive form. Not only is it what the comedian's saying, it's how he's saying it. And it's very important. That's what I teach my kids at USC. It's how the audience is reacting to it, dictates how fast you're going,
right?
How the next joke, when the next joke comes in, how much emphasis you put on. So it's a really interactive art form. And I know most people in the world, their biggest fear more than death is to stand up on stage and talk to people. And then when you add the next level with the expectation of making those people laugh, I think most people just shudder in their boots at the thought of it.
Yeah.
And as you get the next question, as you get the next question ready to go, I saw somebody wrote Sophie Tucker in there, and I talk about Sophie Tucker and these kind of what I call hybrid acts, like Sophie Tucker and Mae West in a way, and who's Fanny Bryce. They all kind of use music and comedy as well to sort of like get in a little bit. But Sophie Tucker was a huge nightclub performer and is also legendary in the world of stand-up comedians because she was one of the first to sell merchandise after the show, her book in the 40s.
So smart.
Yes, before the googly eyes and the t-shirts and the CDs and all of that, she was doing that.
Yeah.
Go ahead. What else do we got?
Sure. Another question is, looking at today, how have audiences with video cameras on their phones, everyone with an opinion on social media, sensitivities, how has that impacted stand-up?
Huge. I mean, I think we all know what happened with Kramer, when that went viral. And there's now, I don't know if you've been to comedy clubs, but a lot of clubs before the shutdown would have something called cell phone locking cases, where you put your camera in a thing. And if you wanted to talk to someone or send a text, you had to leave the room and go outside. So a lot of venues were using those because comedy is unlike like music, is like something that a lot of it is created on stage. Like you sort of work these bits out. Not every comedian, like Carlin is an example of someone who wrote word for word and then just recited it. He became more of a writer.
Right. A little more literary.
Somebody in the chat totally got that 100%. But a lot of comedians like have a vague idea, like, oh, I want to do a bit about Taco Bell, and I'm going to work it out and see if the double-decker bit works, or more the crunch, the chalupa, the Crunch Wrap Supreme, or
if someone films you when you're halfway done and puts that on YouTube, that's going to really impact your ability to finish that bit. And
oh, look at this. Sophie was from Hartford. I didn't know that. Awesome.
Yeah.
Guys, this is so fun for me. I love talking about the history of stand-up. And I will say this, I feel like most people are generational when it comes to stand-up comedy, which means like the comedians they saw when they were a kid, or when they were from 10 to 30, like those 20 years are like the greatest of all time. And that anyone that's now doing comedy is not as funny. And the comedians before them were hacky and corny and old-fashioned. And that's just the nature of stand-up. It's just like you tend to grab. It's a lot of art? What do you mean by that?
Well, movies from your generation, music from your generation, people always argue that that's the best.
Right. Yeah.
The next one is, I lived in the Catskills for a few years and probably read a bunch of books about the Golden Age and the Borscht Belt. Can you talk about the significance of that time and place?
Yeah, that's in my chapter about resorts, nightclubs. And the Catskills kind of became known as sort of a place where Jewish families came up from New York during the hot days of the summer and had specific entertainment for them. So that was, and it was incredible because there's a Yiddish word called tumler, which means to create tumult. So I had these funny guys like a Buddy Hackett who would like entertain the people all during, they do Simon Says, they'd walk into the pool fully clothed. And it was a real breeding ground for comedians, but it wasn't. I feel like the Catskills, with all due respect, is a little overstated because there were many other scenes, especially in New York City, that weren't just for Jewish comedians up in the Catskills. And so and then in the winter, there was Miami Beach was huge because they had a big racetrack down there called Hialeah. And then, of course, in the mid-40s, Vegas opened up, which was a year-round resort. Because Miami was seasonal, Catskills was seasonal, Vegas year-round, plus they had the bonus, you could also get prostitution.
And you could make so much money in Vegas at that time.
Right.
Like an amount of money that you really couldn't make anywhere else.
No question. Oh, no question. Because for the first time, Vegas, let me give you an example. Let's bring it back to Mark Twain. Mark Twain's gross was based on how many people came to see him at the Opera House in Spokane. How many people came to see him at this theater or thing. It's based on ticket sales. That's Vegas. The comedians were paid as a percentage of the nightly drop of the casino, which is how much money the tables made. Yeah, so if the tables made a lot of money. Yeah, so it's a whole people are like, what the oh my God, I'm making 18 grand a week when I used to be making $6 grand a week in a nightclub. It was, it blew people's minds because it was a different economic model. Oh,
one of the next questions. Now in the digital era, we can listen to a lot of old radio online. But when you were a comedy nerd back in Florida, where were you finding and listening to those things?
Guys, this is going to make me cry. That's unbelievable that you remembered that from earlier in this conversation. There was a couple companies that were starting to put radio shows on record. And actually, the first time I heard a radio show was when like I told you, I was a geek. I was a ventriloquist in high school. And I learned ventriloquism on this record called Lessons in Ventriloquism with Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. And on the record, he was like, here's a routine you can use to make your friends laugh. And it was an old radio routine of his. It was like,
oh, they were just promoting using someone else's routine, whole cloth?
No, he was using his routine. Yes, he was saying you can use my routine that I did. Yeah. It was like, I didn't, but it was very generous of him. Yeah. And then there was a company called Radiola out of New York, Croton on Hudson. I don't know what that means. Oh, look at this. And then there was also this guy named George, I'm going to mispronounce his name, Garabedian or something like that, who was like a real archivist of early sound, any sound recording. And by the way, just a side note, the first million-selling comedy record was not Bob Newhart, not Red Fox with Laugh at the Party from 1956. It was a single in 1913 called Cohen on the Telephone, which was about a guy, new telephone user, again, trying to talk to his landlord on the telephone. And you would only hear one side of it. Yeah. Oh, Rhino Records. Look at this. Okay.
Whoa.
Katie, you're doing unbelievably great job. I'm really enjoying
there's
this.
So many great questions. This is wonderful. Okay. Would you make a distinction between the most popular comics of their time and the most influential of the craft? And that's from Rick Jenkins.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Rick.
I feel like the most popular tended to be the most influential. I'm trying to think of someone who was like completely underground that only the comedians loved. I mean, there was a guy named Richie Craig, I know, in late vaudeville, early nightclubs that I hear a lot of Bob Hope talk about. I don't even know what his act is. There's no radio recording of him.
But I have no idea. Stuff of legend.
Yeah, Richie Craig is one, I would say. But for the most part, God, that's a darn good question.
Yeah. But you can also see the opposite too. You know, the most popular is not always the most influential.
Right. But I know it's really fun. It's really fun. I mean, I think about these Netflix special guys, like it's incredible. Burr and the guy in my book, Chappelle. Chappelle did 4 Netflix specials in 2017. 4. Just try to wrap your head around that.
Okay. As we've moved into Zoom and other online live comedy shows, what are your thoughts on decreasing the distance between the audience member and the performer?
I don't know.
It's a
I mean,
complicated
that's really complicated. Thank you, Katie. Who knows? I mean, I do know that 2 people that got huge network deals during the lockdown was Sarah Cooper, who did lip syncing of Donald Trump, and whether this turns out to be the start of a huge career or like a Vaughn Meter situation, we'll find out. We'll know in a year or 2.
one.
And the other one was Z-Way, and she's incredible.
Oh my God.
She did Instagram. She did a show on Instagram, but she
But
could
now
also
it's a Showtime show.
and now she has a Showtime variety show. So
good.
I have no idea. I do think, and again, I'm not about the future, but I do think having the ability to connect visually, they're called front-facing comedians, by the way, because they use the front-facing camera on their phone.
Sure.
To connect digitally will enhance most comedians' careers going forward. That's whether it's 10%, 50%, 80%, who knows?
Yeah.
Good question, though. Damn, these are good.
I have a feeling you won't like this one as much. This is who's your favorite of all time.
I love
it's always hard.
No, I was hoping it was the guy. Is there a program going on? Is there?
Yeah, what the hell is this?
Is this supposed to be a program? I don't really. I know it sounds like I'm ducking it. I will tell you. I think you can tell in the book that I love the radio guys. I loved Carlin and Pryor.
Yeah,
I have a special affinity for Steve Martin and what he did and creating that. And I was just. And there's also a comedian that not many people talk about because he does piano and I do music in my act, called Victor Borga, who is this incredible, has the record for the longest running one-person show in Broadway history. And so he is, I hold him. And there's like this weird comedian. If anyone here has ever heard of him, I'd be shocked. And his name is Roger Ray. He played the marimbas. And he's just a great act that I saw early on, completely obscure comic and also Dick Shawn I liked very much. But I have to say, I'm really inspired by Maria Bamford and Patton Oswalt. And
weren't you in one of her specials?
Yes, I'm in. Yes, yeah, good, very nice call. But and Paul F. Tompkins, and I just think the comedy today is as good as it's ever been. Is my number one thing. It's as good as it's ever been.
It's always great to hear.
Yeah.
It looks like we have only a few minutes left, so if Jen wants to come back.
Yeah, Jen, come back in. I don't want to go. I don't want to go over. I feel like this could go on for hours.
And I wish it would. I think our audience wishes it would too. You two really should take this show on the road.
Really?
Oh my gosh, it's been amazing. Incredible. Just really invigorating and thought-provoking and fun too. So thank you both very much. And Katie, thank you for taking over the Q&A. I'm afraid they're going to dock my pay, but whatever.
No, I just thought it was more like,
it was perfect. Yeah. It was perfect. Yeah. And just addressing our friend Fred, who was having trouble with the crowdcast. We're glad that Fred has made his way in.
It's one of the best. You will admit that's one of the best insults you've ever heard. Like watching it and go, is this a program? I thought I was supposed to go to watch a program. Who are these two idiots?
He just wasn't in at all yet, but he's here now, so thank goodness.
Welcome, Fred.
And I'm just selfishly, I'm going to say that I'm glad that you brought up the recordings. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and Martin Mull, Sex and Violins, and I'm Everyone I've Ever Loved were so influential, and you get that sound in your head too. I think that's so important, that you're not seeing the person, but you get the rhythmic humor sound in your head, and I think that influences the way you approach humor.
Well, I made the point in my book that those records, whether it was Red Fox in 1956 or Bob Newhart in 1960 or Shelley Berman or Mortzall or, as you say, Martin Mull, they were the first, in a way, if you think about it, the first comedy specials, even though there was no visual, but you put it on and you're like, oh, I'm in this environment. I'm transported now to what, the Hungry Eye or Mr. Kelly's or any of these venues they would record these records at. And it really, to me, those are the first generations of real comedy nerds, the ones who would really break down. There's a great story of Bill Maher, who does that HBO show, listening to Robert Klein's first album, which is called Child of the 50s, and transcribing it just word for word. Like, okay, I want to know what this guy's doing, and wrote out the whole album word for word. Just so it's like, all right, I want to learn. And that's how he learned. One of the ways he learned how to be a comedian.
Wow, that's powerful. That's really exciting. There were a couple questions that were kind of Mark Twain scholarly, and Katie and Wayne, you did a great job of those. Oh. If people have those questions that went unanswered, I know that our curatorial staff is represented here tonight by Mallory, who's been very helpful in the chat. Thank you for that, Mallory. I know we'd be really happy to answer that kind of question afterward. And the chat remains live in perpetuity. So this is being recorded. People can come back and watch it whenever they want, just following the same link. But you can keep on chatting with one another. So if you have that kind of question that our curatorial team can help out with, please go ahead and pursue that.
Can I also quickly just say a quick thank you to Alana? She helped me get the books to your place. I had never done that before, so she was great. Thank you. Sorry.
No, I'm glad you did. And we mentioned Alana earlier as having connected us with you, so we're grateful to her for that too. Yeah. And of course, the book, The History of Stand-Up. Purchase it if you weren't convinced beforehand.
You're not going to say Mark Twain? You're not going to say Mark Twain?
Well, full title.
Full title, man.
The History of Stand-Up from Mark Twain to Dave Chappelle by Wayne Federman.
Thank you.
Is the book we're selling tonight. I will show you that you can get a signed copy. So that's the added value and very, very
incredible.
I don't know. Yes.
I do want to address the very sweet and kind question from one of the audience members who asked about the fate of the Mark Twain house. As I said at the beginning, we can use all the help we can get, and anything you can do to help us is deeply appreciated. Wayne and Katie and I actually had a conversation before we got started about jinxing things. And I'm not inclined to want to jinx anything, but I would say that things are looking, because our staff has been so dedicated and our board has worked so hard, I think that we might be okay. But again, don't take anything for granted. So please continue to support us in any way that you can. Wayne and Katie, I cannot remember a better evening. This has just been fantastic. And my only regret is that you're not here in Hartford with us to take a tour of the Mark Twain house and maybe go up to the archives and take a look around. So can you both promise that you will join us in person one of these days? And
of course,
do it upright.
Of course.
I'll try. I will do my best. I would love to. I mean, I'm into Twain, obviously. He's a big part of my book. So, excuse me, big part of one of the chapters of my book.
All right. Katie, will you come visit us?
Yeah. Well, and I'm a little closer. He's on the other side of the country. So,
and we look forward to hearing you talking in October.
And that might be in person, depending on what happens in this country. We'll see.
Well, either way, we're looking forward to it. And Wayne, both of you, one of the things we would like to point out is that the Mark Twain House is a writer's home and a home for writers. And you now both are part of our circle of writers. So that's not worth anything other than my having said it out loud. But we're so glad to have you among us. And thank you for a fantastic evening. And thank you to the audience for your fantastic questions and
that was really a
participation.
Blast. I had a hunch. The Mark Twain people were going to know some comedy.
Yeah.
I had a hunch.
Well, you were right.
Also, I wanted to say I got a few questions about what books I have behind me.
Can I guess? Can I say it? I see Cliff Nesteroff's The Comedians.
The Light Blues,
I see Seriously Funny by Gerald Nachman, which is about the new wave comedians that came out. Mort Saul, really Lenny, incredible. The red one.
The red one is mine.
No, that's your book. Okay, and what's the one above the red one?
It has to be Born Standing Up, Steve Martin.
Oh, Steve Martin.
Oh, well, Katie, I'm going to speak for a moment while I'm saying another word. Please get the red book and show it to us. We want to see your book. And I'm just going to highlight my IBM Selectric. Somebody mentioned that I do have a Selectric behind me. And that's...
The Darks. What do you...
Hold that up, please.
This is the Dark Side of Stand-Up. I wrote chapter and a half in this book. It's an academic press book, so no need to run out and buy it because it's dumb expensive, but get it from your library and read about stand-up. That's my recommendation.
I love it. All of those books on your shelves are amazing. They're really incredible.
Yeah, if people want more comedy book recommendations, my YouTube channel, I've made a bunch of videos recommending really great books, including Wayne's and lots of other ones. So it's just my name on YouTube. You can check that out if you'd like. There's some good
somebody
stuff.
wants the link. Somebody wants the link for something.
We'll put that up right after we close down.
Yeah, sure.
Take time, but we'll throw it in again. You can check back in marktwainhouse.org. You can rewatch this, and I do want to invite people back for next Tuesday evening. We have Joe Riola, who was the longtime editor of Mad Magazine, and he's going to be talking about his experience with that and talking about a history of satire also. So please join us for that. And thank you both again so much. It's been an absolute delight.
This was lovely.
Thanks.
Don't be strangers.
Okay.
And I'm going to end the broadcast. So